All right, welcome back to another episode of the Phrasing FM podcast, where I talk about languages and my experience building an app to learn them. Today, we are going to be talking about fossilization. So, if you are not chronically online and spend way too much time engaging in the language learning YouTube sphere, then you're probably wondering what the heck is fossilization. And fossilization are these patterns that, if you do something wrong over and over and over and over and over, it just becomes ingrained as a habit to the point where you can't break it. You learn something wrong once, and then you'll never be able to unlearn it. It has been fossilized in your speech. And it sounds very scary. And, a lot of people will use this online, especially in the language sphere. It's very trendy at the moment to scare people away from doing things on their own, is really how I see it being used a lot. It's also commonly used as advice against using AI because you don't want to fossilize these AI mistakes into your own language. It's used against self-study. It's used against learning from non-native speakers. It's used for a whole bunch of stuff that just basically says, hey, don't do whatever you can to learn a language because you might get a fossilization, you might fossilize a mistake, and then you'll never be able to recover. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think fossilization is, let's see, has it been 90 seconds? Yes, it has, is bullshit. And first of all, to start off with, I'm not saying fossilization does not exist. I am absolutely not qualified enough to make such a statement. It is clearly a well-documented phenomenon. And, there are also things that I have fossilized in my own native language, in English, and nobody ever notices. It's not something that holds me back in my English at all. I still sound perfectly native. I still am perfectly native. I'm still quite fluent, sometimes even articulate. And so I don't think fossilization is this massive thing to be scared of. For demonstration purposes, when I say the word actually, I never actually say that. I say actually with a CH. Or when I say also, I normally put a T in there. I say also. And I have tried to change these and they're just not changing. I've said them for 30. I'm sure if I really tried and I really practiced, I could get rid of them. But they're not a problem. This does not hinder my speech. I do not sound ineloquent when I use these. If anything, I sound overly eloquent if I try not to use them. And so this is a reason, one of the big reasons that I don't think fossilization is really anything to be scared of. Sure, if you fossilized something much more major, then it might be an issue. But fossilization is going to happen, and it's not always that big of a deal. The bigger reason that I am against fossilization, though, or I guess I could say point number 2, is just because you learned something once doesn't mean you fossilized it. I have countless examples of things that I have learned in foreign languages that I have used for decades before somebody corrected me, and I never made that mistake again. And I don't know how much more quote unquote fossilized something could get, or how much more exposure and repeated use of a word how much more you'd have to use a word before fossilizing a mistake if it's not in the scale of decades. And I mean, examples, like I always said zinsgebouw in Dutch for sentence structure. And this was a word that I used all the time because people would, I'm learning Dutch and they're like, oh yeah, Dutch is really difficult, right? And I'm like, oh, it's actually pretty easy. The sentence structure takes a lot to get used to. The zinsgebouw is heel moeilijk. And I said that for nearly a decade. I mean, thousands, if not tens of thousands of times, I said zinsgebouw until one day, a friend of mine was just like, zinsgebouw? You know it's zinsbouw, right? And my mind was blown. I have made this mistake so many times, not a single person ever corrected me on it until, nearly a decade after learning a language. And I've never mixed that up again in my life. It's just, I got corrected. I learned. If anything, the mistake was more painful for the fact that I've been making this mistake for years. And so it just cemented itself in my memory much, much stronger. Another example is I learned French in high school decades ago. And I say I learned French in high school, but a variant of French in high school, you could say. I don't know what they were teaching me. I was learning from French speakers, but I learned the worst form of French that ever existed, and I don't believe it's real French. And so most of my life has just been unlearning the things that I learned in French class. And one of them was simone, simone, simone for week. So this week, c'est simone. That's how it's spelled. It's got an AIN at the end. However, that's not how it's pronounced. It's pronounced semaine. And I just found this out this year, multiple decades after speaking French. And the word for week, I never got corrected on. I never picked up that there was a difference in the pronunciation, but somebody pointed out the difference to me. They corrected it to me. My mind was blown. And now this one, I do still occasionally make mistakes with. Maybe it's fossilized forever. However, I would say 90% of the time I get it right. And of the 10% of the time that I get it wrong, I would say 90% of that I corrected immediately afterwards. I'll say, no, c'est cement, c'est cement, c'est cement, c'est cement. And it's an automatic correction. And, keep in mind, this was a couple weeks ago that I got corrected on this. And this is a couple decades that I've been saying Simone. And if it's that quickly to fix these things that are that old of mistakes, I don't think fossilization is something that you need to be concerned about from the get-go. It's not something that you need to worry about not learning from the perfect material, not learning from non-native speakers, not learning from AI, not learning all of these excuses. They're just reasons not to learn the language. They're reasons to be scared of learning the language, scared of making mistakes, and scared of everything else. And the whole, if you just erect barriers and if you're scared in language learning, that's going to hinder your progress the most. Learning a language is about making just more mistakes than you've ever made in your life until you stop making mistakes anymore. That's the whole name of the game. And so anybody who's telling you, be careful about making mistakes because they might get fossilized, they're actively holding you back with that advice. Now, is it good to maybe be aware of this? I don't think so. Aren't you glad I'm bringing it to your attention? um, but yeah, so that's my big case against fossilization. There's another really big thing that I want to talk about fossilization, and that comes from the fact that a lot of these people who are raising the alarm bells about fossilization, they will normally also recommend doing what is called language acquisition. So I'm not going to re-explain that here. If you've heard of language acquisition, you know what I'm talking about. I guess I'll explain it a little bit so that narratively makes sense, but it's just exposing yourself to content that you can kind of understand, and then you'll pick up bits and pieces, and you do that over and over, and you learn a language. You don't have to study anything. You don't have to do vocab lists. You don't have to do reviews or grammar lessons or anything. You just expose yourself to the language and eventually let your brain figure out how it all works. Now, when you're doing this method, which is a method that almost everybody online recommends, you are making so many mistakes in your head. You are assuming that words mean things that they are completely not even remotely related to. You are understanding words incorrectly. You are mixing up different words. You are not realizing that two different words are actually two different words. You think they're the same word. You're literally, I don't know how to express, if you haven't done this method, how many mistakes you make and how much you're just left wondering and how much you don't piece together until the 1,000th time that you've seen it. And after 10 or after 20 or 40 or 50, you're like, okay, I kind of got this word. And then after 1,000, you're like, oh no, I didn't understand that correctly at all. And so a lot of these people who are saying, be careful about fossilization, they'll also then turn around and recommend comprehensible input, and they'll recommend language acquisition, which just is so counterintuitive in my head, because what are you, if you're going to fossilize from you learning a language on your own, but then you recommend comprehensible and acquisition or language acquisition and comprehensible input, how are you not then just going to fossilize all of these misinterpretations that you make of all of these different words? And you know what, maybe you will, and then it's just the whole argument falls apart, kind of for both of these, but that's a whole nother episode. And so yeah, this is my little rant about fossilization. Now, I've seen it a bunch online because I am way too tuned into the online language sphere, partially because I'm way too tuned into languages, and partially because it seems work-related, so I can easily tell my brain that, this isn't time wasted. This is time spent researching for work. Uh, but a lot of these people, you'll notice, they'll warn you about fossilization, talk about how much of a problem it is, and then tell you how you should only learn from, reviewed sources and, teachers and all these things. And then, hey, what do you know? They're a teacher, or they have a book, or they have reviewed sources, or they have something to sell you at the end of it that is conveniently not non-fossilization proof. So that's always one of my big detriments about it. Now, to recognize my own bias, I do have an application. In the previous episode, I talked about how I don't have a problem learning from AI-generated expressions. And then in this episode, I talk about how I don't think fossilization is a problem. So I do have something to sell you. However, this is completely separate from that. This podcast is just me to talk about languages and nerd out about it. And the point I want people to take away from this is not, okay, cool, then I can go learn a language with phrasing. The point to take away from this is that learning a language is going to require making a whole bunch of mistakes. And if you're hearing any advice out there that, don't make mistakes, be careful making mistakes, then really reconsider the advice or where it's coming from. That's all. Yeah. And also, don't be worried about fossilization. Maybe keep an eye on it. If you realize you have a bad habit, then start working on it early. I do think it's good to work with the tutor as soon as possible and get these things ironed out. But not everybody can afford a tutor all the time. Not everybody has it in their schedule, and these things can always be ironed out later. If I can relearn words in overnight after a decade of exposure or multiple, maybe it'll take a couple weeks to learn semaine. But if I can relearn these words after decades, then I'm not really worried about learning words incorrectly in the beginning either. Another example just popped into my head, and this might be a bad example, but when I was starting to learn Dutch, I did have a private tutor, and I started just about every sentence with the word nu, which means now. Because in English, now you can start a second sentence like this, or now I'm going to go do that. And it's a very common filler word that we use in English. And I just injected it everywhere in my Dutch. I'd always start the sentence with nu, which means now. And this doesn't sound good in Dutch. This isn't how Dutch people speak. And so I was constantly being corrected from day one from a certified language teacher trying to beat this habit out of me to the point where she was getting so frustrated because it would come out so naturally for me to say nu that I just could not get rid of it. And every single session, we'd harp on about this, that we can't start a sentence with nu. We can't start a sentence with nu. That's not how you start sentences in Dutch. It doesn't translate that way. And I understood this perfectly. It just came out of my mouth. And so how did I ever get over this? I just kind of stopped caring. Really, I stopped going to that tutor at some point. Things changed in my life, and I just stopped going to private tutoring, and I exposed myself to enough of the language, and I talked with other people to the point where I just got other Dutchisms in my head that I didn't have to lean on these English mistakes. I don't think that I got it beat out of me. I don't even think that having a private tutor made it much better. It's just that where I was in my language learning journey was a time that I needed to make a bunch of mistakes. And I was so focused on 1,000 other things when I'm talking that I'm not really focused on this one word that it doesn't even have context, really. It doesn't even have meaning half the time in English. It's just a word that you use to join two sentences, or join two thoughts together, separate sentences. And so, yeah, for me, in my life experience, maybe I'm the weird one, but there hasn't been a lot of case for fossilization, at least not as a concern. Maybe you get some things fossilized. Most of the people probably won't even notice. If you do make a mistake for a long time, they can be really easy to fix, especially if you've been making it for a long time. And even if you're aware of your mistakes and get it pointed out in the beginning, that's not necessarily going to stop you from making the mistake. And sometimes the best way to stop making the mistake is just to learn the right way to do it and not worry about not making the mistake. That's not always the best way to unlearn these things. So that's my big Peace against fossilization. I will not plug phrasing at that end of this application or at the end of this podcast episode just because of all the bias talk, but it goes for everybody, no matter how you decide to learn a language. Fossilization, in my point of view, it's way overblown and nothing to be worried about. So thanks for tuning in to the Phrasing Podcast, Phrasing FM, and I'll catch you all in the next episode.